Hi everyone. Today's video lecture is going to focus on political participation, looking at the ways that Americans participate and try to influence government outcomes. To begin with, a definition. Political participation would include all activities used by citizens to try to influence the selection of political leaders and the various policies that they then pass on our behalf. Laws, Supreme Court or other judicial branch decisions, executive orders, bureaucratic regulations, and policies. Political participation is the true essence of democracy, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It requires active participation. When we think about political participation, usually voting is the first thing that comes to mind, and it is, in fact, the most common type of political participation. But there are other methods as well. Things like writing to a legislator, participating in a campaign cause, donating money, filing a lawsuit, attending a town hall meeting, attending a rally or a march for a cause. There are tons of different ways that people can get involved. Now, one of the unique things about political participation in the United States is that we have one of the lowest, if not the lowest, voter turnout in comparison to other developed democracies. However, in terms of those other methods, other ways of participating, we participate at a rate that is fairly comparable to other democracies in other parts of the world. Now, when it comes to participation, there are two types, two categories. Conventional methods of participation, kind of those run-of-the-mill things, voting, running for elected office, collecting signatures for a petition, donating money to a campaign, calling a legislator, expressing your opinion. But then also those less conventional or unconventional methods of participation. Things that are a bit more dramatic. They're rarer events, things like protesting, civil disobedience, even sometimes acts of violence. Things that really get the attention of the media and the attention of lawmakers. You usually resort to these types of participation when those conventional methods haven't yielded the results you were hoping for. Now, when it comes to those conventional methods, voting. I mentioned we have the lowest voter turnout rate of other developed democracies. Only about half of eligible American voters vote in presidential elections. That number drops when we're looking at midterm election years. And we've seen a general trend that we have lower voter turnout in recent years, but we're hoping to start to see an uptick of that. Other forms of participation at the same time, though, have increased. So those other methods besides voting. Unconventional methods of participation, things like protest, civil disobedience, are mostly peaceful. The goal is not usually violence, but sometimes we do see that happen as well. Civil disobedience is the act of knowingly breaking a law you find to be unjust with the hopes of eventually leading it to be changed. The picture that you see on your screen is of a lunch counter sit-in. This was during the civil rights movement in the 60s. Usually in the South, Black patrons were not allowed to sit at lunch counters. They were reserved for whites only. And so student coordinating groups used this nonviolent method of protest to break this law. They sat at the counter knowing that they'd be arrested, but the intended outcome was that it would change. Now, sometimes protests start peaceful and they can end in violence, as was the case here in this image. This was taken at Kent State University. This was an anti-war protest. Students gathered to protest the Vietnam War. The protests would not disperse. The Ohio National Guard was called in. They opened fire into the crowd of peaceful protesters and killed 4 students. Now, just like we had demographic indicators of whether you were more likely to be liberal or conservative, we also have that for indicators of whether or not you're likely to participate in government. So we're going to look at the following demographic factors, beginning with socioeconomic status. Generally speaking, the higher your level of income, the higher socioeconomic status, we see higher participation rates. So the more money you make, the higher you are on the socioeconomic ladder, the higher your participation rates are likely to be. When it comes to race, white voters, white Americans, have higher participation rates than minorities, and minority groups vote at nearly equal levels. In terms of age, We see older Americans are much more likely to participate than younger Americans. There's a stark difference in the voter turnout, for instance, between the 65 plus age group, this blue line, and the 18 to 24 age group, this orange line. Notice that even though we have those trends up and down, there's always a stark difference. Those 65 plus, those older Americans, much more likely to turn out at the polls than younger Americans. And this holds true for those presidential election years, where you see the spikes, and then those midterm elections 2 years later, that level of voting drops, where it then picks back up to that higher presidential voting level. In terms of education, the higher level of education, the more likely you are to participate. So for instance, college-educated Americans are more likely to participate in politics than those with high school education or lower. But one caveat to this is when white, Black, and Hispanic voters of equal incomes are compared, the minority voter is likely to participate more. Now, why does this all matter? Well, your political ideology, the political culture that we have in this country, all of those things play a very powerful role in shaping the information that our policymakers have for the types of policies they're going to advocate for. A lot of the policy debate in this country revolves around these competing ideologies, these differing interpretations of core values of the American creed. And it all boils down to then finding this right balance. How do we protect individual personal liberties while also promoting social order and looking out for the general welfare? What we do know, though, is that those who participate, those who show up on election day, those who vote, will have more power to influence policy creation and implementation than those who do not. Because the people who are elected into office, they're going to advocate for those who voted for them. So policy will reflect the will of those who vote. So your political ideology, your opinions on issues, your ultimate participation will matter in this democracy. It can help influence policy. Ideology affects what we think about government, what we want our politicians to do about various issues. And we express those preferences through voting, because politicians and parties are going to have different approaches to policymaking because of our differing views. And parties are going to try to appeal to us by focusing on issues that matter to those who vote and participate. So again, policy is going to be created by policymakers, and they are going to reflect those who chose to participate in the democratic process. So in thinking of that, these parties trying to get our votes, political ideologies of voters translate into the working platforms of the two major parties. So we can see how the differences between liberals and conservatives translate to many of the policy stances that the Democratic Party take, representing the viewpoints of liberals, and that the Republican Party take, representing the viewpoints of conservatives. Now, keeping in mind this table is very oversimplified, but we can start to pick out liberal beliefs, liberal ideology, conservative beliefs, conservative ideology, and how that translates into the working platforms, the types of policy outcomes that our two major parties are trying to achieve. This ends our video lecture. If you have any questions on anything we discussed today, make sure that you come ready to ask them tomorrow.